It was early October 2021, and my job had sent me to a border town in northern Montana. I worked for a construction supply company, and this particular trip was to finalize a deal with a local contractor building cabins along the US-Canada border. I wasn't thrilled about it. The weather had turned cold, the drive was long, and the area was so remote that cell service was spotty at best. Still, work was work, and I couldn't say no. The contractor, a guy named Lewis, had a reputation for being difficult. The company told me he was picky about details and always wanted to meet in person, no matter how far away it was. That's why I was driving up to this cabin, his latest project, on a 2-lane road that snaked through dense forests and past lonely fields. There wasn't much around, just the occasional ranch or hunting cabin, most of them looking empty for the season. After 4 hours of driving, I finally arrived at the coordinates Lewis had sent me. It wasn't a construction site like I'd imagined, but a small ranger's cabin tucked into the woods. The place looked like it had been around for decades. The wood was weathered, and the windows were streaked with dirt. A faded US Forest Service sign hung crookedly over the door. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. There was no car outside, and the place seemed abandoned. I double-checked the address, then stepped out of my rental car, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The air was colder than I expected, and the wind whipped through the trees, making a low, hollow sound. I knocked on the cabin door, but there was no answer. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. Feeling uneasy, I walked around the cabin. The back was overgrown with weeds, and there was an old woodpile stacked haphazardly near the rear wall. A rusted axe was stuck in a stump nearby, its handle splitting from age. I peeked through one of the windows, but the glass was so grimy I could barely see inside. What little I could make out didn't look promising. Just a single room with a table, a chair, and a wood stove in the corner. I was starting to think I'd been sent on a wild goose chase when I heard something in the woods. It wasn't loud, just a faint crack of a branch snapping, but it was enough to make me freeze. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me, and I couldn't shake it. I decided to wait in the car. Maybe Lewis had been delayed or had given me the wrong time. I locked the doors and turned the engine on to keep warm, but the isolation was getting to me. The forest around me seemed alive with sounds. Rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional gust of wind. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but it was always just shadows. After about an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out and knocked on the cabin door again, harder this time. To my surprise, the door creaked open under my fist. It wasn't locked. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was just as rundown as I'd imagined. The air was musty, and a layer of dust covered everything. There was no sign of Lewis or anyone else for that matter. The table was empty except for a few faded papers, and the wood stove looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single cot was pushed against the far wall, its mattress stained and sagging. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. The papers on the table weren't old forestry documents like I'd assumed. They were hand-drawn maps, detailed and precise, showing the area around the cabin. Some of the maps had red XS marked on them, and others had notes scribbled in the margins. One map in particular caught my eye. It showed a section of forest about a mile from the cabin, with a large circle drawn around it and the words, "Do not enter," written in bold letters. A chill ran down my spine. Who had made these maps and why? I folded the one with the warning and slipped it into my pocket. Something about the place didn't feel right, and I wanted to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I noticed fresh footprints on the dusty floor. Prints that hadn't been there when I came in. They were large, like a man's boots, and they led from the door to the cot. But there was no one else in the cabin. Panic set in, and I bolted outside. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was just a fleeting shadow, but it looked like a person standing in the cabin doorway, watching me leave. I drove back to town as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a motel on the edge of town. I checked in, locked the door, and pulled out the map I'd taken. The circled area wasn't far from the cabin, but I had no intention of going back to check it out. I didn't know what I'd stumbled into, but it was clear that someone or something didn't want me there. The next day, I called my boss and told him I couldn't reach Lewis. I didn't mention the cabin or the maps. I just said the meeting fell through and left it at that. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about that place. About the maps, the footprints, and the shadow in the doorway. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't natural. And I have a feeling it's still there, watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to get too close. I've always found peace in working with my hands. There's something grounding about shaping raw wood into something useful and beautiful. Over the years, I've made furniture, repaired old barns, and restored cabins for clients who wanted a slice of rural nostalgia. But this time, it was different. I wasn't building for someone else. I was building for myself. It was 2018 when I bought the plot of land. It sat at the edge of a sprawling forest in northern Michigan, about 30 miles from the nearest town. No neighbors, no traffic, just miles of trees and the occasional deer. The property came cheap mostly because of its isolation. That was fine by me. I needed a place to clear my head, to escape the noise of the world, and to pour myself into a project that mattered. The plan was simple. Build a one-room cabin where I could work and live for a while. I'd make the furniture myself, tables, chairs, a bed frame, using wood from the forest around me. I figured it would take a few months of hard work, but I wasn't in a rush. The idea of being alone out there didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like a gift. I started the project in early April. The snow had just melted, and the ground was soft but workable. I parked my truck at the edge of the property, unloaded my tools, and set up a small tent where I'd sleep until the cabin was livable. The first week was spent clearing the site. I cut down a dozen trees, careful to select only what I needed, and stripped the bark to prepare the logs for the cabin walls. The work was exhausting but satisfying. By the end of each day, my arms ached, and my clothes were soaked with sweat and sawdust. The woods around me were quiet, but not silent. During the day, I'd hear birds chirping, the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, and the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. At night, the sounds changed. Frogs croaked from a nearby creek, and coyotes howled in the distance. Sometimes, I'd hear something larger moving through the forest, probably a deer, I told myself, but it always made my heart race. I wasn't scared, exactly, but being out there alone, so far from anyone, made me hyper-aware of every noise. By the second week, I had the foundation laid and was starting to stack the logs for the walls. I worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only to eat and rest my sore muscles. The routine was comforting, but the isolation was starting to weigh on me. I'd catch myself talking out loud, narrating what I was doing, just to hear a voice. Felt silly, but it helped. One evening, as I was packing up my tools, I noticed something strange. A tree near the edge of the clearing had a fresh gash in the bark, about 5 feet off the ground. It looked like someone had struck it with a hatchet, but the cut was jagged, as if done in a hurry. I hadn't been working in that area, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the property. I told myself it must have been an animal, a bear maybe, but the thought unsettled me. The next day, I found more marks. 3 trees, all within a few hundred yards of the cabin site, had similar gashes. They were too high up to be from deer, and too deep to be from claws. I couldn't make sense of it. I kept working, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone dragging a stick across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing, but nothing looked out of place. The sound had stopped. The next morning, I found a line of footprints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin site. They were large, barefoot, and definitely human. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Whoever had made them had walked right past my tent, only a few feet away from where I'd been sleeping. I decided to take precautions. I started keeping my tools inside the tent at night, in case I needed to defend myself. I also set up a crude alarm system using fishing line and empty cans, stringing it around the perimeter of my camp. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. The next few days were uneventful. I focused on building, trying to keep my mind occupied. The cabin walls were nearly complete, and I was starting to work on the roof. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, or a branch swaying when there was no wind. I'd stop what I was doing and scan the forest, but I never saw anything. One afternoon, I decided to take a break and explore the property. I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the sound of the water and the smell of wet earth. About half a mile from the cabin site, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. It was a small clearing, and in the center was a pile of animal bones. They looked like they'd been there for a while, bleached white by the sun, but the arrangement was deliberate. They were stacked in a crude pyramid, with a deer skull balanced on top. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling. It felt like a warning, though I couldn't say from what. I hurried back to the cabin site, my eyes scanning the forest the whole way. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside the tent made me jump. At one point, the cans I'd strung up clattered together, and I bolted upright, clutching a hammer. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to finish the cabin as quickly as possible, then leave. I didn't care how much work I'd put into it or how much money I'd spent. Something wasn't right about this place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I worked like a man possessed, putting in 14-hour days to get the roof on and the door installed. By the end of the week, the cabin was done. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps between the logs, and the roof leaked in places, but it was enough. On my last night, I sat by the fire, staring at the cabin. It should have felt like an accomplishment, but all I felt was dread. The woods were too quiet, as if they were holding their breath. I packed my things and decided to sleep in the truck. I wanted to be ready to leave at first light. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the truck. I sat up, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. The windows were fogged up from my breath, so I couldn't see outside. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The next sound was unmistakable. The slow, deliberate creak of the cabin door opening. I didn't wait to see who or what had gone inside. I started the truck and drove away, the tires spinning in the dirt. In my rearview mirror, I saw the cabin, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I never went back. It's strange how quickly the Amazon rainforest can turn from a place of wonder to something that feels like it wants you gone. I'd gone down there for work, part of a research project mapping deforestation patterns. It was 2018, and I was 32. I wasn't some inexperienced tourist. I had worked in forests before, mostly in the US, and I thought I knew what to expect. But the Amazon isn't like anywhere else. Swallows you whole in ways you can't even explain. Our team had set up a small research station about 20 miles from the nearest village. Calling it a cabin was generous. It was more like a large wooden shack. It had 4 walls, a roof, and just enough space for a couple of cots, a desk, and our equipment. At first, it seemed perfect. The thick canopy above kept the worst of the heat off, and the hum of the jungle felt almost calming. I even enjoyed the rainstorms that rolled in every afternoon. But then, one night, everything changed. Started with rain, of course. In the Amazon, rain isn't a gentle patter. It's like the sky opens up and dumps the ocean on your head. That night was worse than usual. By sunset, the rain was pounding so hard on the roof it felt like the wood might cave in. The sound was deafening, drowning out even the constant buzz of insects and calls of distant animals. I was alone in the cabin that night. One of my colleagues had taken the boat downriver to get supplies, and the others were staying in the village for a few days. I didn't mind. I'd always liked solitude. But as the rain kept hammering down, I started to feel uneasy. The thing about being deep in the rainforest is how isolating it feels. No cell service, no roads, no one around for miles. Just the endless trees and the knowledge that if something went wrong, you'd be on your own. I'd always thought I was okay with that. But that night, with the storm raging outside, the isolation started to feel more like a trap. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. The rain was still hammering down, but the usual jungle noises had stopped. No frogs, no crickets, nothing. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe the storm had scared them off, but then I remembered that wasn't how it worked. Rain didn't silence the jungle. It usually made it louder. I turned off the lamp and sat still, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like something moving slowly through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a tapir or an armadillo, but it didn't feel right. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. Grabbing my flashlight, I walked to the window and shone it out into the trees. The beam of light barely penetrated the rain, but I could see the immediate area around the cabin. Nothing, just wet leaves and muddy ground. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to the cot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. The sound had come from the back of the cabin. Sitting up, I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. The door was still shut, but something heavy had hit the wall. The thud came again, followed by another. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like something was testing the strength of the cabin. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I wasn't armed, apart from a small utility knife. My radio was useless in the storm. Forcing myself to move, I crept toward the back wall, trying to stay silent. I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the rain. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound, like something breathing heavily. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't an animal at all. The thudding stopped, and everything went silent again. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Finally, I decided to check outside. I told myself it was just a precaution, but the truth was, I needed to know if whatever was out there was gone. I stepped outside into the rain, holding the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I swept the beam across the area around the cabin. At first, it seemed normal, just mud and water pooling around the base of the trees. But then I saw them, footprints. They were large, barefoot, and deep, like someone heavy had been walking in the mud. The tracks led from the back of the cabin into the trees. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever had made those tracks wasn't an animal. They were human, or close enough. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, but they disappeared into the underbrush. The thought of going any further made my skin crawl. I backed away and returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner with the knife in my hand, listening to the rain and waiting for the dawn. When the sun finally came up, the rain had stopped and the jungle was alive again. Birds were calling, insects buzzing, everything back to normal. It almost felt like the night before had been a bad dream, but the footprints were still there, half filled with water but unmistakable. I spent the day checking the area, but I found nothing else. No more tracks, no signs of who or what had been there. When my colleague returned later that afternoon, I didn't tell him what had happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. I stayed in the Amazon for another month, but I never felt safe after that night. Every time it rained, I found myself tensing up, listening for that thud on the wall. Nothing ever happened again, but the memory stayed with me. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some local hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know. All I know is that the Amazon is a place that doesn't care about you. It doesn't want you there, and sometimes it lets you know. It was the fall of 2015 when my sister, her husband Ethan, and I decided to spend a weekend at his family's old cabin. Ethan had inherited the place from his grandmother, who had passed away a few years ago. It sat deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far from any main roads, tucked away from civilization. I had never been there before, but Ethan swore it was the perfect place to relax and unplug. The drive up took us nearly 6 hours. As we got closer, the landscape changed. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, and eventually we were driving through thick, towering trees. The woods felt endless, the kind of place where you could easily get lost. The cabin finally came into view, sitting in a small clearing. It was old, made of weathered logs that had turned gray over time. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the windows looked foggy from years of neglect. Ethan parked the truck and we climbed out. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy smell of leaves and damp wood. My sister shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. Ethan seemed unbothered as he grabbed our bags from the truck bed and carried them to the front porch. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just one main room with a kitchenette, a fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft with 2 mattresses. There was no electricity, only an old propane lantern, and no running water aside from a hand pump near the sink. The bathroom was an outhouse about 50 feet away from the cabin. Rustic didn't even begin to describe it. We spent the first few hours settling in. Ethan showed us where the firewood was stacked and how to use the old wood-burning stove. By the time we had a fire going, the sun was setting, and the woods outside were quickly swallowed by darkness. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The loft was drafty, and every creak of the cabin or rustle of the trees outside seemed amplified. My sister and Ethan were asleep on the other mattress, but I lay awake, staring at the slanted ceiling. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I heard a noise. It wasn't the wind or the groan of old wood. It was a deliberate sound, like footsteps on the porch. My heart started racing, and I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, followed by a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then the scraping sound came again, louder this time, and I couldn't convince myself anymore. I wanted to wake Ethan, but I didn't want to make a fool of myself if it turned out to be nothing. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and I eventually fell into a restless sleep. When we stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The wooden steps leading up to the porch had deep gouges in them, like someone had dragged something heavy and sharp across the wood. Ethan shrugged it off, saying it was probably from years of wear and tear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. We spent the day hiking the trails near the cabin. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, but there was an oppressive silence to them, like the trees absorbed all sound. Even the birds seemed quieter here. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. We made dinner on the propane stove, and Ethan told stories about his grandmother. He said she used to spend weeks at a time here, even during the winter, when the snow was so deep you couldn't drive in. As the fire crackled in the hearth, I felt myself starting to relax. Maybe I had let my imagination get the better of me the night before. But that night, the noises started again. It began with the same footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Then came the scraping, this time on the side of the cabin near the kitchen window. I lay frozen in the loft, staring at the dark outline of the window above me. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I heard something bump against the front door, followed by the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. My throat went dry, and I felt my chest tighten. Someone or something was trying to get inside. I reached over and shook Ethan awake. He groggily sat up, but the noises had stopped by the time he was fully awake. He climbed down the ladder to check the door, but it was locked, and nothing seemed out of place. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, we found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, almost like boot prints, but uneven, as if whoever made them was dragging one foot. The gouges on the porch steps were deeper now, and the door frame had fresh scratches on it. Ethan looked worried but tried to downplay it. He said it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe someone who got lost. I didn't believe him. Whoever it was had been there for 2 nights in a row. We decided to stay one more night. Ethan didn't want to cut the trip short, and my sister trusted him. I didn't want to be the paranoid one, so I went along with it. That day, we stuck close to the cabin. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching us, but the woods were still and quiet. When night fell, Ethan locked the door and barricaded it with a heavy chair. He kept his hunting rifle close by just in case. I barely slept, lying awake in the loft and listening for any sound. For hours, it was silent. Then, sometime after midnight, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. The footsteps were heavier, and the scraping sounded more aggressive. Whatever it was circling the cabin, stopping every few minutes to rattle the windows or the door. Ethan grabbed his rifle and sat by the door, waiting. My sister stayed close to him, clutching a flashlight. I stayed in the loft, watching from above. Then, the worst sound yet, a loud crash. It came from the back of the cabin, where the small kitchen window was. We heard glass shatter, and the cold night air rushed in. Ethan shouted for us to stay put as he ran toward the kitchen. My sister followed, but I stayed frozen in place. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps inside the cabin now, followed by a low, guttural noise that didn't sound human. I finally found the courage to climb down from the loft. When I reached the kitchen, Ethan and my sister were standing there, staring at the broken window. There was no one inside, but the floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the air smelled like something foul, something rotten. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and left. A week later, Ethan went back to the cabin to board up the broken window. When he got there, he found more tracks around the property, deep and heavy, leading into the woods. Near the tree line, he found something else. An old, rusted hunting knife stuck in the ground, with dried blood on the blade. We never went back to that cabin. Ethan stopped talking about it altogether, and my sister refused to let him bring it up. I still think about those nights sometimes, wondering who or what was out there in the woods with us. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come back. I parked my old pickup on the edge of a dirt path, the engine rattling into silence. The cabin was barely visible through the thick trees and overgrown brush. It was isolated, tucked near the back edge of an abandoned graveyard that stretched across a low, sloping hill. I'd heard about this place from a coworker who dared me to spend a weekend there alone. He claimed it was used by hunters in the 1970s, but no one had touched it in decades. The challenge sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't resist proving him wrong. A free cabin, even for a weekend, sounded good. It was late October, and the chill in the air made my breath visible. The trees had lost most of their leaves, their bare branches reaching toward a gray sky like skeletal fingers. I threw my duffel bag over my shoulder and grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat. The path leading to the cabin was narrow and uneven, winding between crooked headstones and patches of dead grass. Some of the graves were so old the names and dates had worn away completely, leaving only rough, moss-covered stones. Others had large, ornate markers, cracked and leaning from years of neglect. The cabin came into view as the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't much, a single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, weathered to the point where the wood looked more gray than brown. The windows were dirty, streaked with grime and cobwebs. A small porch sagged at the front, with a rusted lantern hanging from a hook by the door. I hesitated for a moment before climbing the creaking steps and pushing the door open. Inside, the air was damp and musty, like wet wood and mildew. The cabin had a single room with a small fireplace, a rickety table, and 2 chairs. A narrow bed with a thin mattress was shoved against the far wall. A shelf held a few mismatched dishes and a tin coffee pot. The walls were lined with old newspapers, yellowed and peeling. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but there was no electricity. I'd brought lanterns and a few battery-powered lights, so I wasn't too concerned. I set my bag on the table and got to work. I lit a lantern and set it in the middle of the room, its soft glow barely cutting through the gloom. I gathered some dry firewood from a pile near the fireplace and lit a small fire to warm the space. As the flames crackled, I settled into one of the chairs and looked around. The cabin felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound. Creaking wood, the wind outside, the occasional rustle of leaves. I decided to explore the area before it got too dark. With the flashlight in hand, I stepped back outside. The graveyard stretched out in all directions, the uneven rows of headstones casting long shadows in the fading light. I followed the path around the edge of the graveyard, noticing how the graves became older and more weathered the farther I went. At the very back, near the tree line, I found a cluster of graves that looked different from the rest. They were smaller, almost child-sized, and the markers were simple wooden crosses, many of them rotted and broken. Something about them unsettled me, but I shrugged it off and turned back toward the cabin. The night settled in quickly, the darkness thick and heavy. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, beans and canned stew, then stretched out on the bed. It wasn't comfortable, but I was tired from the drive and the hike, so I didn't care. I fell asleep quickly, the firelight flickering on the walls. I woke up hours later, heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. The sound of something tapping against the window caught my attention. I froze, straining to hear. It was faint, like fingernails against glass. I told myself it was probably a branch in the wind, but when I got up to look, there was nothing outside. No trees close enough to touch the cabin, no animals, nothing. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, scratches on the walls, creaks on the porch. It was probably just the old cabin settling, but in the dead of night, every sound felt amplified. I finally drifted off just before dawn. The next morning, I decided to check the area around the cabin. I found scratch marks on the wooden walls, deep grooves that didn't look like they were made by an animal. The porch steps had fresh scuff marks, as if someone had been standing there. I shook it off as paranoia. Maybe the wood was just old and brittle, and I hadn't noticed the marks the night before. I spent the day wandering the graveyard, taking photos and jotting notes for my coworker. The isolation was starting to get to me. I kept feeling like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just rows of graves and empty woods. That night, the noises started again. This time, it was louder. Thumps on the roof, footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The fire was out, and the cabin was pitch dark. My heart raced as I listened, trying to pinpoint the sounds. Then came the unmistakable creak of the door handle. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The door didn't open, but the handle jiggled again, harder this time. I grabbed the lantern and lit it quickly, the light flooding the room. The sound stopped. I waited, flashlight in hand, but nothing happened. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the porch was empty. The ground was damp from the evening dew, and there were footprints leading away from the cabin.
Bare footprints.
They disappeared into the graveyard. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with a hunting knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, waiting for dawn. When the first light broke over the horizon, I packed my things and left. As I walked back to the truck, I glanced over my shoulder at the cabin one last time. The door was closed, the porch empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me leave. I never told my coworker the full story. I just said the cabin was creepy and left it at that. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear those faint tapping sounds, like fingernails against glass. I don't know if it's just my imagination or something that followed me home. Either way, I don't think I'll ever sleep in a place like that again. It was the fall of 2017, and I had been looking for a quiet place to clear my head. Work had been overwhelming, and I felt like I was drowning under the weight of deadlines and stress. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape, a place where I could disconnect from everything and finally breathe. I found a rental listing online for a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Michigan, far from any towns or highways. It was described as secluded and peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I packed light, just enough clothes for a week, some canned food, and a few books to keep me company. The drive out was long, but the further I got from the city, the lighter I felt. The air smelled fresher, the trees lining the winding road seemed endless, and the noise of civilization faded away until all I could hear was the hum of my car and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The cabin was smaller than I had expected, but it had a certain charm. It was made of weathered wood, with a small porch out front and a single rocking chair that creaked in the breeze. There was a fire pit a few yards away and a small shed in the back, though I had no plans to use it. I stepped inside and was immediately struck by how quiet it was. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. The interior was simple: a small living room with a couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it had seen better days. A handwritten note on the counter welcomed me and mentioned that there was no cell service, but the cabin had a landline for emergencies. That didn't bother me. I had come here to unplug anyway. The first 2 days passed without incident. I spent my time reading on the porch, hiking the nearby trails, and cooking simple meals. The solitude was exactly what I needed, and I felt like I was finally starting to unwind. But on the third night, things started to feel off. It began with the noises. At first, I chalked it up to the natural sounds of the forest, branches creaking in the wind, animals rustling in the underbrush. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew stranger. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze, my heart racing. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the deliberate pace of the steps didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I found nothing unusual outside. No footprints, no sign of anything that might have caused the noise. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to take a long hike to clear my head. The trail behind the cabin wound deep into the woods, and for the first hour, it was peaceful. But then I noticed something strange. A faint smell, like something rotting. It was faint at first, but as I walked, it grew stronger. I searched for the source, half expecting to find a dead animal, but I found nothing. The smell eventually faded, and I tried to put it out of my mind. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the uneasiness returned. I decided to build a fire in the fire pit, hoping the warmth and light would push away the creeping sense of dread. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me whip my head around, but I saw nothing. Around midnight, I decided to head inside. As I was putting out the fire, I thought I saw movement in the woods, just a flicker of motion out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but whatever it was had disappeared. My pulse quickened, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I considered leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. I had come here to escape stress, not to create new fears. So I stayed. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But by nightfall, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I decided to check all the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. As I was closing the curtains in the living room, I caught a glimpse of something outside. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't dare turn on the lights, afraid of drawing attention to myself. I sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight, and waited. Hours passed, but the figure never approached the cabin. I told myself it could have been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside, large, unmistakably human footprints. They led from the tree line to the fire pit and then back into the woods. My stomach churned. Whoever it was had been watching me, standing just feet from where I had been sitting the night before. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a hurry, throwing them into my car without caring if they were organized. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange on the porch. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with twine. It hadn't been there the night before. My hands shook as I picked it up and examined it. There was nothing overtly threatening about it, but the fact that someone had left it there while I slept filled me with a deep, primal fear. I got in my car and drove away, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Even as I reached the main road and the safety of civilization, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, but I know one thing for certain: I'll never go back. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. I had just turned 32, and life in the city had worn me down. The constant noise, the endless deadlines, and the suffocating crowds made me crave solitude. I wanted silence, a break from everything. So, I found a cabin online that promised complete isolation, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains. It seemed perfect. The cabin was in Tennessee, far from the nearest town. The website described it as rustic, which I took to mean no Wi-Fi and maybe a wood-burning stove. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted peace. I packed lightly. Clothes, some food, a flashlight, a book, and my hunting knife. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I figured it was a good idea to have it, just in case. I arrived in the late afternoon after driving for nearly 6 hours. The last stretch of the journey was along a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through the forest. My small sedan struggled with the uneven terrain, and I couldn't help but think I should have rented an SUV. Still, I made it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees. The roof was mossy, the wood was weathered, and the windows looked a little warped. But it had a certain charm. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where I parked. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were birds chirping and the distant rustle of leaves. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed, a small table, and a fireplace. There was a tiny kitchenette with a sink and an old propane stove. The bathroom was an outhouse a few yards behind the cabin. No electricity, no running water. It was primitive, but it felt right. I unloaded my things, lit a couple of oil lamps, and settled in. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, reading by the flickering light. The silence was almost overwhelming, but I welcomed it. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. I didn't even notice the creaking sounds that came from the woods as the wind moved through the trees. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I had no phone signal, so I couldn't rely on GPS, but I had brought a map. The trails weren't well marked, but I figured I'd stick close to the cabin. I walked for hours, taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, with sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. I saw deer tracks, heard the distant call of a hawk, and even spotted a fox darting through the underbrush. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping low. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended and made a mental note to be more careful. As I approached the cabin, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange tension in the air. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my tired mind, and went inside. That night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out what had startled me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. It was coming from outside, near the edge of the clearing. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or a deer, but the sound didn't move like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, telling myself it was nothing. I opened the cabin door and shined the light toward the trees. The beam didn't reach far, but I saw nothing unusual. Still, the rustling continued, now seeming to circle the clearing. My heart pounded, and I closed the door, bolting it shut. The noise stopped after a while, and I eventually fell back asleep. But in the morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside barefoot. The prints circled the cabin, stopping occasionally as if whoever made them had been standing and watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping nearby and had gotten lost. Maybe they were curious about the cabin. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from anything. I shook it off and decided to go about my day. I spent most of it chopping wood for the fireplace, trying to keep myself busy. That night, the noises came back. This time, it was more than rustling. I heard twigs snapping and what sounded like quiet footsteps. I stayed inside, clutching my knife and flashlight, too afraid to open the door. The sounds continued for hours, stopping and starting, always just beyond the edge of the clearing. In the morning, I found more footprints. They were closer to the cabin now, and there were more of them. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I decided to leave. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. But when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the hood and found nothing wrong. The car was old, but it had never given me trouble before. It didn't make sense. With no way to leave, I was stuck. I spent the day trying to figure out what to do. There was no phone signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk before dark. I decided to wait until morning and hike to the main road, hoping to flag down a passing car. That night, the noises were worse. They started earlier, just as the sun was setting. I heard heavy breathing outside the cabin, and at one point, something scratched at the door. I stayed up all night, sitting by the fireplace with my knife in hand. When dawn finally came, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I grabbed my backpack and started walking toward the main road. The forest felt different, darker, quieter. Every snap of a twig made me jump. After an hour, I realized I was lost. The trail I thought I was following had disappeared, and the trees all looked the same. I stopped to get my bearings, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the distance between the trees. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could tell they were watching me. I froze, my heart racing. Then they moved, disappearing into the shadows. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I went as long as it was away from them. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst. Eventually, I stumbled back into the clearing where the cabin sat. I had somehow gone in a circle. Desperate and out of options, I locked myself inside the cabin. I stayed there for 2 more days, surviving on the food I had left. The noises never stopped. Sometimes I heard footsteps, other times whispers. I never saw who or what it was, but I knew they were out there, waiting. On the 3rd day, I woke up to silence.
No rustling, no footsteps.
Just the wind in the trees. I cautiously stepped outside, clutching my knife. My car was gone. The patch of dirt where it had been parked was empty, with no tire tracks leading away. Just empty space. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, not caring about the direction. Eventually, I stumbled onto the main road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. I never went back to the cabin, and I never found out who or what had been out there. All I know is that something was watching me, and it wanted me gone.